The Greek word for man is anthropos, and the word anthropology has been in the English language for centuries. But just what does the word mean? Well, literally, anthropology means the study of man. However, as British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead noted, it's a well-founded historical generalization that the last thing to be discovered in any science is what the science is really about. And as Paul Bohannon, renowned anthropologist, pointed out a number of years ago, each science that deals with people has its own definitions of human. An economist, he explains, defines a human as a choice-making animal. Philosophers define man as a rationalizing animal. Anthropology attempts to be all-inclusive, the study of human behavior in all places and throughout time. It specializes in the description of humanistic, scientific, biological, historical, psychological, and social views of humans. Now, to paraphrase Barbara Miller's statement in her textbook, Cultural Anthropology, the popular impression of anthropology is based mainly on movies and television shows that depict anthropologists as adventurers and heroes. Well, now, some do have adventures and discover treasures in Egyptian tombs and elsewhere, but mostly their work is less glamorous and involves repetitive and tedious activities. Now, until around the middle of the 19th century, anthropology was a term used for all humanists. Now, my lecture today explains the fields and branches of anthropology. Now, we're going to begin by stating that anthropology is the study of human behavior in all places and at all times. Now, Western civilization takes credit for the development of anthropology, which, as a matter of fact, was a relatively late science. Earlier Greek and Roman philosophers were more interested in speculating about the ideal society rather than describing those known to them. Now, after the onset of the Age of Exploration, which included the discovery of the Americas, as well as travel to other distant places, the study of non-Western people began in earnest. In modern day, anthropology is a recognized social science with two broad fields and several branches or subfields. Now, the two broad fields are physical anthropology and cultural anthropology. Let me give you a brief description of each. Physical anthropology is concerned with the development of man as a mammal. Related subjects are anatomy, biology, and paleontology. Now, physical anthropologists study the evolution of the human species. And one way they do this is by the comparative analysis of fossils, preserved remnants of once living creatures and living primates, which include human beings or Homo sapiens. Common fossils are shells, bones, and molds or imprints. Now, these are found buried in the earth or permanently frozen in glaciers. Living primates are analyzed in order to study the mechanics of evolution and genetic differences among human populations. Now, let's talk about cultural anthropology. This field is the study of learned behavior in human societies. Now, most cultural anthropologists limit themselves to a few geographic areas. For example, Margaret Mead in Samoa and New Guinea, and Clyde Kluckhohn with the Navajo Indians in the southwestern United States. And I should mention that Kluckhohn's work, Mirror for Man, is considered one of the best introductions to anthropology. Now, cultural anthropology and the scientific study of human culture will be discussed in more detail in our next lecture. The subfields of cultural anthropology are archaeology, linguistics, and ethnography. Archaeology is the study of different cultures through material sources rather than direct interviews or observations of the group under study. One example of a famous archaeological site discovered in the past century was King Tut's tomb near Luxor, Egypt in 1922. Linguistics, as you probably know, is the study of language as communication among humans. Culture is learned and transmitted primarily through language. Ethnography is the systematic description of human societies, mostly based on first-hand fieldwork. Based on ethnographies, anthropologists provide ethnologies or explanations of behavior of different peoples. Now, the second subfield of ethnography is social anthropology. Now, social anthropology is concerned with people as social beings. A related subject, of course, is sociology. Let me also mention briefly psychological anthropology, which deals with human personality and feelings. Now, these are greatly influenced by an individual's biological and mental characteristics, as well as physical surroundings and personal experiences. Related subjects there are psychology and psychiatry. Now, it's important to note that there are several universals common among all societies. For example, the basic similarities in human biology and the existence of two sexes. Another of these is education, either formal or informal or both. Education is necessary to provide the young with the skills and attitudes needed to carry on as adults. So you might ask, what are the practical applications for such a broad field? Well, the answer is that anthropology helps us plan the future and helps us contribute to the solution of human problems. This newest area of the study of man is applied anthropology. Now, formerly, anthropology was limited to the academic field. Anthropologists were teachers or museum curators. But for the past several decades, large numbers of anthro graduates have been employed in fields such as urban planning and administration, healthcare, and international development. Now, most important is that although anthropologists have taken up the task of documenting the processes and changes of cultures past and present, they also provide the necessary insight into where the human species is heading. Let me begin the lecture today by asking, what exactly is culture? Now, this question has been approached by anthropologists in many different ways. Murdoch, for example, in Outline of World Cultures, produced what many have called the ultimate laundry list of things cultural by naming 900 odd categories of human behavior. I won't attempt to go into these at this time. But another less lengthy list is the famous grocery list of Edward B. Tyler. He wrote, "Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society." Now, another definition of culture that many find useful is the totality of learned socially transmitted behavior. Now, obviously, this definition leaves out much if we feel obligated to include all the ways of life that have been evolved by people in every society. Now, a particular culture, then, would mean the total shared way of life of a given group. This would include their ways of thinking, acting, and feeling, as reflected in their religion, law, language, art, and customs, as well as concrete things such as houses, clothing, and tools. Cultural anthropology is the study of cultures living and dead. In its totality, it includes linguistics, the study of speech forms, archaeology, the study of dead cultures, and ethnology, which is the study of living cultures or those that can be observed directly. So why study cultural anthropology? Well, one reason noted by Ruth Benedict, another well-known anthropologist, is that the story of humanity from the Stone Age to the present is such a fascinating one of cultural growth. Now, interestingly, every society has gone through 3 stages or steps of cultural growth. These are savagery, barbarism, and finally civilization. The last is, of course, to varying degrees. We're often reminded of another compelling reason to learn about different cultures, to learn and use a foreign language effectively. Now, most of us realize that knowing the language of another culture is not enough for meaningful communication. You can ask anyone who's tried to use their high school Spanish inside a Spanish-speaking country. Now, Ned Seeley, in his 1993 book, Teaching Culture, lists 6 skills to nurture and support intercultural communication. And number 1, cultivate curiosity about another culture and empathy towards its members. 2, recognize that different roles and other social variables, such as age, sex, social class, religion, ethnicity, and place of residence, affect the way people speak and behave. Number 3, realize that effective communication requires discovering the culturally conditioned images of people when they think, act, and react to the world around them. Number 4, recognize that situational variables and conventions shape people's behavior in important ways. Number 5, understand that people generally act the way they do because they're exercising the options their society allows for satisfying basic physical and psychological needs. And finally, number 6, develop the ability to evaluate the truth of a generalization about the target culture and to locate and organize information about the target culture from books, mass media, people, and personal observations. Now, culture and society must coexist. Without living together, people cannot create a culture or a way of life. If a group or society is small, isolated, and stable, it might also share a single culture. For example, think of the Tassidae, allegedly a Stone Age people in the Philippine rainforest who were discovered by anthropologists back in 1971. A side note is that due to their supposed isolation, they had no weapons or known words in their language for enemy or war. Now, in your reading after the lecture, you'll learn more about the Tassidae and the controversy surrounding them up to the present time. But it's important to remember, however, that large societies such as those in Canada, the United States, India, Egypt, are multicultural or pluralist societies. They also tend to have many subcultures. In the long history of human life, multiculturalism is a fairly recent phenomenon. Those of us in multicultural environments must remember that discovering similarities among people from different cultures is as important as identifying differences. For example, in classrooms on just about every university campus in the world, we find students from many different social and ethnic backgrounds. What are some of the universals that you and other international students have all experienced in your earlier educational life? One common universal is that all cultures use rewards and punishments to encourage correct behavior. Another example is that societies withhold certain information from the young. Now, this might include faults in our leaders or sexual taboos. A third universal is the effort by the controlling group in a culture to educate the young to strengthen and secure its dominant position. In the majority of contemporary societies, this control is reached through political means, and in contrast to military actions of earlier times, such as the Roman conquests and the Moorish invasions. In closing this lecture on societies and culture, let me remind you not to forget the contributions of thoughts and actions of the individual person in a group. Note the observation of Edward Sapir, another famous anthropologist. It is always the individual that really thinks and acts and dreams and revolts. Now, obviously, the concept of culture will be argued by anthropologists for years to come.
To many people throughout the world, some of the most remarkable and puzzling monuments of ancient times are the pyramids of ancient Egypt. You know, almost nothing at all remains of the great cities of the kings of Egypt, the pharaohs. Time and weather have been really hard on ancient Egypt's cities and towns, but several of the temples, statues, and most important of all, the pyramids have survived. Even though many of the pyramids are in ruins, they still give us some idea of the magnificence of ancient Egypt's civilization. A civilization that, after all, lasted for more than 3,000 years. Remember, when we're talking about ancient Egypt, we're talking about at least 30 consecutive dynasties. A dynasty is a series of kings or queens of the same royal family, something like the Romanovs of Europe, the Ming dynasty of China, or the Al Sauds of Saudi Arabia. As many of you probably already know, the pyramids were constructed as tombs or burial places for the Egyptian kings and their family members. You see, the ancient Egyptians passionately believed in life after death. In fact, their entire culture revolved around that belief. The kings, queens, and state officials often spent an entire lifetime preparing for their life after death. They did this by collecting possessions or grave goods, by building tombs, and so forth. The Egyptians believed that they could be assured of an afterlife only if their bodies could be preserved from decay or destruction. So when a person died, and especially when a pharaoh died, in order to ensure his eternal life, he had his body embalmed or mummified. In other words, he had his corpse dried out and wrapped in linen to preserve it from decay. Then he had his mummy hidden. This whole idea may seem quite strange today, but the ancient Egyptians really believed that if one's mummy was destroyed, then his or her soul would be destroyed. And if, on the other hand, the mummy, the dead body, was preserved, the soul would be immortal. Let me repeat that. If one's mummy was preserved, the soul would go on living. For another thing, the ancient Egyptians believed that the dead person could take his or her earthly possessions along to the next world. This is just the opposite of the Western idea that you can't take it with you when you go. Anyway, the dead person was provided with food, clothing, furniture, weapons, and even servants. It was not at all unusual for the pharaoh's slaves to be put to death so that they could serve him in the afterlife. So you can see why the pharaohs wanted to have their bodies and their possessions hidden, to protect them from grave robbers. Before they died, they had special tombs built for this purpose, to hide their bodies and their treasures. In the early years of ancient Egypt, these tombs were the pyramids, the vast burial chambers that were built to fool the grave robbers. Unfortunately, the grave robbers almost always outsmarted even the most powerful and the most careful of pharaohs. They broke into most of the pyramids or tombs and stole the food and other treasures they found. They even desecrated and destroyed the mummies of the dead. Needless to say, they would not bother a poor person's grave. These grave robbers even banded together into organizations or brotherhoods. Just imagine a grave robbers' union. Now, as for the actual construction of the mighty pyramids, it was during the first and second dynasties that the kings and nobles of Egypt began to construct the type of tomb called the mastaba. The first and second dynasties lasted from about 3100 to about 2665 BCE. Mastaba, by the way, comes from an Arabic word meaning bench or long seat. A mastaba looked like a low, flat-topped rectangle, something like a low bench or a shoebox. Essentially, the pointed pyramid was no more than an extension upward of the flat-topped mastaba. The first typical pyramid, or at least what most people generally think a pyramid looks like, was built during the Third Dynasty, which lasted roughly from about 2664 until 2615 BCE. This pyramid was for King Zoser, that's spelled Z-O-S-E-R, in about 2650 BCE. It was built by an architect named Imhotep, I-M-H-O-T-E-P. This pyramid was constructed as a series of giant steps or stairs. It, along with others of its type, is called the step pyramid. It was really simply a pile of mastabas, each step smaller and higher than the one before. The step pyramid of King Zoser was different from the later pyramids because it was never covered with stone to give it a smooth surface. Actually, it was not until the 4th dynasty that the most famous pyramids were built. The 3 great pyramids of Giza belong to the 4th dynasty pyramids. The 4th dynasty covered the period from 2614 to 2502 BCE. They are located near the town of Giza on the west bank of the Nile River, just outside the capital city of Egypt, Cairo. The Great Pyramids are really the very best preserved of all the Egyptian pyramids. The largest of these pyramids is known as the Great Pyramid, and great it is. It was built for King Khufu, that's K-H-U-F-U. Khufu was called Cheops, C-H-E-O-P-S, by the Greeks, and so the pyramid is sometimes called the Pyramid of Cheops. It has been estimated that 2.3 million blocks of limestone were used to build the Great Pyramid. The blocks averaged 2,500 kilograms each. The largest stone block weighs about 15,000 kilos. The base of the pyramid covers 5.3 hectares, an area large enough to hold 10 football fields. There's a story that the conqueror Napoleon once sat in the shadow of the Great Pyramid and calculated that the mass of stone in the pyramid could be used to build a wall 3 meters high by 0.3 meters thick around the entire country of France. In terms of height, the pyramid was originally 147 meters high, but today the top 10 meters are missing, and the entire outer limestone covering has been stripped away. It seems that local builders and conquerors found it convenient to strip off the limestone from the pyramids and use it to build with. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is considered a wonder of ancient architecture. When you look at it, you immediately wonder how on earth the ancient Egyptians ever managed to build such a structure with only basic mathematics, with no modern machinery such as cranes, bulldozers, and so forth, and with no iron tools. They had to cut the big limestone blocks with tools made of copper, which is a rather soft metal, but they managed to do it. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, that's H-E-R-O-D-O-T-U-S, Herodotus said that 400,000 men worked for 20 years to build the Great Pyramid. Archaeologists today doubt these figures, but of course the true statistics cannot ever really be determined. It is thought, though, that at least 100,000 people worked to build any single pyramid. Most of these workers were slaves. They worked on the tombs during times when the Nile River overflowed its banks and covered the fields. The Nile's flooding made farming impossible and made transportation of the stone to the pyramid site easier. The 2nd and 3rd pyramids of Giza were built by Khufu's successors. The tomb of Khafre is the 2nd pyramid of Giza. Khafre is spelled K-H-A-F-R-E. It was originally 3 meters lower than the Great Pyramid. However, today it is only 0.8 meters lower. Its present height is 136.2 meters. The 3rd pyramid, built for Menkaure, covers only half the area occupied by the Great Pyramid, and it is only 62.5 meters high. Menkaure is spelled M-E-N-K-A-U-R-E. None of the later pyramids that were built during the next 13 or 14 centuries were nearly as large or as magnificent as the pyramids of Giza. And even though pyramid building continued right up into the 11th and 12th dynasties, that was up through about 1786 BCE, it was becoming increasingly clear to the pharaohs and the nobles of Egypt that the pyramid method of burial provided very little or no protection at all for their royal corpses. The pyramids were, of course, impressive and lasting monuments, but they were all too visible. They invited grave robbers to try to break into them. And so eventually one of the pharaohs, King Thutmose I, decided to sacrifice publicity for safety in the construction of his House of Eternity. I don't need to spell Thutmose for you, do I? Instead of ordering the construction of a pyramid, Thutmose had his tomb dug out of the rock of a valley, far from the Nile River and far from Cairo. The spot he chose was some 11 kilometers from the river on its west bank. The area is now known as the Valley of the Kings. Many pharaohs followed Thutmose's example. After him, most of the pharaohs abandoned above-ground pyramid construction in favor of underground hiding places as the burial places for their precious royal bones. And yet, what is so ironic is that even these tombs did not escape the attacks of the grave robbers, persistent devils that they were. I'll end this discussion by pointing out that when the ancient Greeks first saw the Great Pyramids of Egypt, the pyramids were already 2,000 years old. The Greeks called them one of the 7 wonders of the world. Almost nothing remains of the other 6 wonders, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Temple of Diana, and so on. But the 3 mighty pyramids of Giza, as well as 32 other recognizable pyramids, still stand. These pyramids of Egypt are monuments to a great and ancient civilization and to people's endless search for eternal recognition and eternal life. The fields of history and archaeology go hand in hand. Let me explain what I mean. History is often the story of a particular person, a person like the Emperor Napoleon. Or history is the story of a nation, such as the country of France. On the other hand, archaeology is the study of the people, the customs, and the life of ancient times. Archaeologists find out about these ancient times by studying the ruins of cities, monuments or tombs, or any written records that remain. In today's lecture, I'm going to talk a little about a particular person in ancient Chinese history. And I'm also going to talk about one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the late 20th century. The history part of my talk will be about Qin Shi Huang, who was the founder of the first unified empire in China. He lived between 259 BCE and 210 BCE, and he is often called the first emperor of China. Just as the exploits of the Emperor Napoleon still fascinate many people and scholars today, so does the story of Qin Shi Huang and his House of Eternity. Today I'm also going to be talking about what has been found to date in the area of Qin Shi Huang's tomb. We don't know what additional treasures of Chinese history and culture will be found in the tomb or tomb mound in the future, but what has been discovered so far is an incredible find for ancient Chinese history and archaeology. To set the historical context for the excavation of Qin Shi Huang's House of Eternity, I'd like to first talk a little about the man himself. His name was Ying Tseng, and before he unified the empire in 221 BCE, China had been torn apart by wars between 7 regional kingdoms. Under the leadership of Ying Tseng, one of these regional kingdoms, the Kingdom of Qin, eventually defeated the other 6 kingdoms. Ying Tseng's defeat of the other 6 kingdoms accomplished 2 things. First, it ended the power of these other 6 kingdoms. Second, the unification of the 7 kingdoms started a centralized imperial system that lasted more than 2,000 years. When he became emperor, Qin Shi Huang did a number of things to unify and protect his empire. First, he standardized the system for writing Chinese characters. Prior to his unification of the empire, the writing of Chinese characters varied in the different kingdoms. When Qin Shi Huang became emperor, he decreed that a standardized system of Chinese characters was to be used throughout the empire. Next, he decreed that there would just be one system of weights and measures, and one system of currency, rather than many different systems, as had been the case before unification. To protect his new empire from the barbarian tribes to the north, he ordered the construction of the Great Wall of China. Now, there were already small walls scattered around the northwest frontier of the empire, but Qin Shi Huang had these walls joined together to create 1,500 miles of fortification and protection for his empire. Qin Shi Huang also began an enormous road-building project. In the second year after unification, construction of 3 major imperial highways was begun. These highways eventually stretched approximately 6,800 kilometers, or 4,225 miles, throughout the empire. Just in comparison, by the year 150 CE, the Roman Empire's road system was about 5,984 kilometers, or 3,718 miles. The Roman Empire's system stretched all the way from Scotland to Rome and then to Jerusalem. Qin Shi Huang also began another large construction project, the building of his tomb or mausoleum. It seems that as soon as the emperor gained power, he became preoccupied with death and with constructing a magnificent house of eternity for his afterlife. At this point, I'm going to segue from talking about the biography of Qin Shi Huang to talking about the archaeology part of my lecture. Let's see. Okay, as I mentioned, when Qin Shi Huang became emperor, he immediately began construction of his house of eternity. And what an incredible house of eternity it was. Archaeologists believe that 700,000 laborers were forced to work on the tomb for about 11 years. The entire area of the tomb covers approximately 56.25 square kilometers. It's believed that the tomb was intended to be a microcosmic replica of the Qin capital around the years 221 to 210 BCE. Archaeologists also believe that Qin Shi Huang's tomb contained imperial palaces filled with rare gems and other treasures, and that it also contained gardens and temples. It is even believed that the chemical mercury was pumped through the tomb to create the image of flowing rivers in the tomb area. Can you imagine rivers of mercury in a tomb? A 12,000 square meter area at the site of the tomb has a very high mercury content. In fact, 10 times higher than that of the surrounding areas. So archaeologists think it is very likely the mercury rivers did indeed flow through the tomb area. Without a doubt, the most striking features of the Emperor Qin's House of Eternity are the terracotta warriors and horses found in the tomb area. In 1975, Chinese authorities built a museum on the excavation site to preserve these terracotta warriors and horses and the other incredible treasures that were being uncovered. Today, the museum covers an area of 16,300 square meters. That means the area is more than 2 football fields long. The area is divided into 3 sections, or what are called pits. Number 1 pit, number 2 pit, and number 3 pit. Number 1 pit is the largest of the 3 pits. It is approximately 960 square meters in size. It first opened to the public on China's National Day in 1979. In number 1 pit, there are columns of soldiers at the front, followed by war chariots at the back. It's estimated there are 3,210 terracotta foot soldiers in this pit alone. 2 years later, In 1976, number 2 pit was unearthed. It contained nearly 1,000 warriors and 90 wooden chariots. This pit was opened to the public in 1994, and today visitors from all over the world go to see Qin Shi Huang's House of Eternity and to see his terracotta army that was to protect his tomb. Altogether, more than 7,000 terracotta soldiers, horses, chariots, and even weapons have been found in these 3 pits. And more will likely be found in the future as archaeologists continue to explore and excavate the tomb area. I'd like to finish up my talk by referencing what Peter Hassel of National Geographic magazine says about the ancient Chinese emperor's views of the afterlife. Mr. Hassel says that the emperors of ancient China saw the afterlife as a continuation of life on Earth, much as the ancient Egyptians did. He also notes that archaeologists working on the tomb of the first emperor of China are dusting off a window to the past. They're dusting off this window to give us a vision of what mattered to the ancient rulers and their cultures. We have much more to learn from the tomb of the first emperor of China as excavation of the tomb area continues. We don't know when the excavation will be complete. Chinese officials say that the tomb mound of the first Chinese emperor will not be excavated until preservation techniques have advanced significantly. Well, that's about all I have to say for today. For homework, I'd like you to read the description in your textbook of the terracotta warriors and horses found in Qin Shi Huang's tomb. See you next time.
The women's movement in the United States is a social movement that is nearly a century and a half old, according to Barbara Ryan, author of Feminism and the Women's Movement. According to Ryan, organized activity on behalf of women's rights began in the mid-1800s when, both by law and by custom, women were considered non-persons. Married women, for example, were prevented by law from inheriting property, from controlling the money that they earned, or from retaining custody of their children if they were divorced by their husbands. In addition, no woman was allowed to vote on the laws that governed her life. In the early 1900s, important changes occurred in the social and political climate in Europe and the United States as a result of World War I. After the war, a number of countries granted women the right to vote, and in 1920, American women gained the right to vote. 20 years later, another war brought major social changes that affected the lives of many men and women. One of the social changes involved women working outside the home. During World War II, large numbers of women entered the job market to do the jobs of the men who had been drafted into military service. A great many of these women became factory workers, and they proved themselves to be capable and dependable workers. Today, women have gained more employment and job opportunities, and they hold different jobs and occupations. Women are breaking into male-dominated fields, from sports writing to police work to firefighting, though their progress into these male-dominated professions is slow. In fact, women make up only 1.5% of the 200,000 professional firefighters in the United States today, and they make up only 4% of airline pilots and navigators. In addition to entering male-dominated professions, many women are starting their own businesses and operating successful businesses today. It is becoming more common to find women occupying positions of leadership in American business. In fact, women-owned business is one of the fastest-growing segments of the United States economy. In 2003, for example, the U.S. Small Business Administration reported that in the United States, 9.1 million women-owned businesses employed 27.5 million people and contributed $3.6 trillion to the American economy. In other words, women business owners are critically important to the American economy. According to a 2004 study by the Center for Women's Business Research, the nation's hotspots for women entrepreneurs are clustered in the western part of the United States. Idaho and Wyoming are tied for first place, followed by Utah, Nevada, and Arizona, as the 5 states in the United States where the greatest growth and expansion in women-owned businesses occurred. Between 1997 and 2004, on average, the number of women-owned businesses in these 5 states grew at more than twice the rate of the rest of the country. The average rate of women-owned businesses was 28.8%, compared to 14% for all other states in the United States. As many as 10 years ago, women-owned businesses employed more people domestically than the Fortune 500 companies did worldwide. Why are women entrepreneurs so successful? The founder and president of the American Women's Economic Development Corporation in New York, Beatrice Fitzpatrick, says, "A woman would no more let her business fail than she would let someone kill her child." But for some women, success in business has not come without the costs of overwork, burnout, and potential damage to health, friendships, or family relationships. According to the authors of the book Megatrends for Women, the great challenge for millions of successful women entrepreneurs and other professionals is to maintain their success while being sure that they have a balance between work and their family and social lives. Women have advanced to leadership positions not only in business, but also in politics. Women have become important political leaders all over the world, though politics is still largely a male-dominated world. For instance, in 1969 in the United States, only 4% of the state lawmakers were women. By 2003, this number had grown by more than 500%, and 22.3% of state legislators were women. Although this may seem like a great increase, it must be remembered that women make up more than 50% of the population in the United States. So, they are not yet receiving equal representation in the world of politics in the United States. The United States has not yet had a woman president, although women have served as presidents of Ireland, Nicaragua, and the Philippines. Many other countries have had female political leaders. Women have served as prime ministers in the United Kingdom, France, Turkey, Pakistan, Canada, and Bangladesh. The family has changed a lot since women have become so active outside the home. Today, less than 10% of American families have the traditional working father and the mother who stays home to take care of the children. To make up for the time that women are spending out of the home, many men are having to play more of an active role in raising their children. Government and businesses are also becoming more concerned about helping working families with child care. But much more needs to be done to help women and men take care of their children while they're at work. In spite of the fact that the rate of women's participation in the workforce rose from 27% in 1940 to 57.6% in 2003, including more than half of all women with a child under the age of 1 year, there is still no government-sponsored child care or parental leave policy in the United States. According to Barbara Ryan, a major obstacle to women's emancipation lies in the lack of government-sponsored social service support for working women who have children to support. Because problems are still preventing some women from taking equal place in society, many people still believe that a women's movement is still necessary. However, many diverse opinions have emerged about how to achieve equality for women and men in work, education, politics, and the home. Some activists in the women's movement call themselves feminists, whereas others who resist political activism choose not to label themselves feminists because they feel that the U.S. media often portray feminists as people who are anti-men. Most feminists do not take such an attitude at all. In any case, the word feminism and the principles of feminism are not easy to define because they mean different things to different people. In her book, Feminism and the Women's Movement, Barbara Ryan provides a number of definitions of the term feminism. She quotes one woman who says that, in her opinion, feminism represents the best of what it means to be human. Anybody can be a feminist, except you have to work at it. Basically, to me, it is the belief that everybody should have the opportunity to be the best that they can be, and we ought to have a world that encourages that. The names and terms associated with the movement, however, are not nearly as important as the changes that feminism and the women's movement have caused in American society. Because of this century-and-a-half-old movement, women are contributing more to American society, and society is benefiting from their contributions. As a result of the women's movement, women's liberation, and feminism, women are enjoying new freedom, new opportunities, new responsibilities, and new headaches.
The women's movement has gained a lot of attention in recent years in the U.S. and in countries around the world. As you heard in the last lecture, the women's movement has inspired many women to fight for equal rights and treatment in their homes, their personal relationships, and at work. It has also forced many women to examine and to rethink the roles they play in society. However, not only have women begun to examine and rethink the roles they play at home and work, and in modern society as a whole, but men also have begun to examine and rethink the roles they play in society, and to examine and rethink the various and changing roles they must play at home and at work today. Men have also begun to react in both positive and negative ways to the new expectations they must meet at home and work. Some men are adjusting well to the new roles that they must play as more and more women enter the job market. And some men are pleased that their wives and partners have jobs outside the home. However, some of the role changes men are having to make to accommodate their working wives and girlfriends, and some of the new expectations concerning their masculinity, are causing some of them a good deal of stress, anger, and confusion. Some men are even asking the question, what does it mean to be a real man in today's world? Many are confused about how they should treat women, whether these women are their female colleagues at work, their friends, or their wives. Some feel they are no longer king of the castle at home. As a result of this confusion and unhappiness, a counter-movement called the men's movement has sprung up alongside the women's movement in the United States. Men in the movement seek to provide one another with support that they need to cope with the stresses and strains of being a man in today's world, and to cope with the stresses and strains brought about by the professional advances made and the personal freedoms won by women in many countries over the past few decades. Some women view the men's movement as a backlash against the professional advances women have made and the personal freedoms they have won as a result of the women's movement. Many men, therefore, and many women also, see the men's movement as men's need to form a brotherhood for psychological support, just as women have formed support groups with other women. Others see the men's movement as men's attempt and need to understand more fully what it means and takes to be a real man at the start of the 21st century, when traditional definitions of manhood are changing or are under attack in many countries around the world. To begin this discussion of some of the catalysts for the men's movement, I'll say just a few words about why some women consider the men's movement a reaction against the women's movement, what the well-known author Susan Faludi calls the backlash against the women's movement. Ms. Faludi suggests that some men feel that women are becoming too independent and powerful today as a result of the professional advances they've made in the workplace and because of the personal freedoms they have gained in their family and personal relationships. She notes that the resentment of some men toward women's gaining power is not a recent phenomenon. More than 1900 years ago, the women of Rome tried to repeal a law that forbade them from riding in horse-drawn chariots and from wearing multicolored dresses. In 195 BCE, the Roman senator Cato expressed the fear and concern that the women of Rome had become so powerful that the independence of the men of Rome had been lost in their homes and was being trampled underfoot in public. In her book titled Backlash, The Undeclared War Against American Women, Susan Faludi points out that many men today still resent women's progress in becoming independent personally and professionally. Faludi notes that a 7-year survey of American male attitudes in the 1980s found that no more than 5 to 10% of the men surveyed genuinely supported women's demands for independence and equality. It is likely that this attitude has not changed much today. Although some women view the men's movement as a backlash, many others see the men's movement as something that is good for both men and women. They see it as men's need to form a brotherhood for psychological support to protect their rights and personal freedoms, even as women form support groups with other women to protect and advance their rights. They think, for example, that women should not automatically be given custody of children when a divorce occurs, and yet this is what happens in the United States today. Finally, some authorities relate the development of the men's movement to the confusion created by the crisis of masculinity in contemporary society and the many and changing images portrayed in the popular media of who and what real men are and how they are supposed to act. If you watch American movies, you might find yourself asking, is the real man, for example, a sensitive guy like Dustin Hoffman's Tootsie? Is he an involved dad like Robin Williams' Mrs. Doubtfire? Or the father played by Steve Martin in Parenthood? A macho man like Arnold Schwarzenegger plays in The Terminator? Or is he a caring nurturer like the man Schwarzenegger played in Kindergarten Cop? Many men are searching for answers to this question and are attempting to find answers from the leaders of the men's movement. What are the origins of this crisis of masculinity that poses problems for many men today? Well, one of the historical reasons for the crisis, according to Robert Bly, a poet who is considered to be one of the founding fathers of the men's movement, is rooted in the changes that took place in the U.S. as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which occurred in the early to mid-1900s. When the Industrial Revolution began, the kinds of work that people did, that is, the kinds of work men did, of course, changed for many Americans. Before the Civil War, 88% of American males were small farmers, independent artisans, or small business owners. In these professions, the workers usually worked close to their homes. This meant that sons were constantly learning how to work and support themselves and their family by working alongside their fathers. By 1910, however, less than 1/3 of all men in the United States were self-employed. Sociologist Michael Kimmel points out that even then, many men felt that the concept of manhood was being threatened and was even vanishing because men no longer worked their land or had control over their labor. Many never got to see the fruits of their labor, as farmers and craftsmen usually do. Many men in the post-industrial revolution era had become mere cogs in the machines of industrial America. In addition, the change from a farm to an industrial society meant that instead of supporting their families by working near their homes as farmers, craftsmen, or small business owners, the majority of men began working in factories or offices. Often, the factories were far from their homes, and men had to travel long distances to work. This meant that the men were not home, and the amount of time fathers spent with their sons was greatly reduced. Young boys, therefore, did not have their fathers around to act as role models. The effects of the Industrial Revolution continue into the present day, according to men in the men's movement, and they want to address the problems it has brought. For example, many people are concerned that men still have little say in the upbringing of their children. The evolution of the women's movement had a profound effect on the development of the men's movement. As a result of the women's movement, more women are working outside the home, and many men are playing a more active role in family life, and they are taking on some of the tasks involved in childcare and housework. 30 to 40 years ago, care of the home and children was almost exclusively the responsibility of women. In addition to these changes inside the home, in the workplace, men are today entering occupations that used to be considered women's jobs. More men are becoming nurses, and teachers of young children. Other men are finding that they have more female colleagues and bosses at work than ever before. And they're having to adapt to women's styles of communication and management, which can differ considerably from those of men. At work, as well as at home, many men today in the U.S. have to play very different roles than their fathers did. As a result, they are joining with other men in the men's movement, or they are reading books such as Robert Bly's Iron John to try to understand and cope with the roles expected of men in today's world. So some of the reasons for the men's movement can be attributed to three things. One, the changing roles brought about by the women's movement. Two, the Industrial Revolution. And three, men's desire to understand and affirm the concept of manhood. Exactly what forms does the men's movement take? And what do men in the men's movement hope to achieve by being active in the movement? To begin with, the men's movement has no unified, monolithic philosophy. Although there are a number of unifying themes, there are also some interesting differences between the basic groups associated with the men's movement. Several writers who write about the men's movement have identified four basic groups of men active in the movement. The first group is labeled the male feminists, and these men work for women's rights and equality between the sexes. Some of the men in this first group are vocal about blaming other men for much of the violence against women and for the inequality that exists between men and women in relationships and in the job market. Not all members of the men's movement, however, consider this first group of men to be an integral part of the men's movement. To be sure, the other three groups focus more on men's issues than do the so-called male feminists. The second orientation in the men's movement attracts men who join men's support groups to meet regularly and give and receive psychological support in dealing with problems created by the new roles they have to play at home and at work. These men are attempting to learn to better express their feelings and emotions and to show sensitivity without being ashamed. A third group in the men's movement consists of men who want to get back the power they feel they've lost because of the advances made by women as a result of the women's movement and feminist causes. Finally, there is an approach to the movement called the mythopoetic men's movement. The mythopoetic men's movement is often identified with Robert Bly, the poet, who wrote one of the most well-known books of the men's movement, Iron John. The men involved in this aspect of the men's movement believe that men should be initiated into manhood as men were initiated when people still lived in small tribes and bands and ancient cultures. Now, this group initiates men using mythology, poetry, hence the name mythopoetic, and other rituals such as dancing to explore and affirm the value of masculinity and masculine approaches to problem solving. Men who subscribe to this viewpoint worry that too much contact with women and too little contact with other men has turned them into weaklings or wimps. So the men's movement is very diverse. A man who wants to join the movement has many options of just how he will explore the question, what does it mean to be a man in today's world? What do women think of the men's movement? Just as there are many different ways for men to approach the men's movement, there are many different opinions about the value and worth of the movement. Some women, especially many feminists, do not like the men's movement. They feel that it is a backlash and that it is an example of how men are trying to keep women from achieving equality by forming stronger good old boy or male-only networks and by advocating women's return to their roles of housewife and mother rather than business partner or competitor. However, some women, particularly those whose husbands are part of the men's support groups or who have gone on men's weekend retreats, are glad that men are learning to express their emotions and getting support from other men. Barbara Brotman reports in an article in the Chicago Tribune that one woman she interviewed is glad that her husband has joined the men's movement because she no longer feels that she alone is responsible for their family's emotional well-being. She and her husband now share that role and responsibility. This lecture has been only a brief introduction to some of the issues related to the men's movement. Because of many different perceptions concerning the goals and purpose of the movement, it is difficult to give a simple definition or draw a simple portrait of the movement. Perhaps it would be better to say the men's movement is like a tree with many branches and many roots. The movement is much younger than the women's movement, but in one form or another, it is beginning to have substantial impact on many men and women as they try to adapt to their changing roles in American society in the 21st century. Today's lecture deals with the topic of language, culture, and communication in classrooms in the United States. Samovar and Porter, in their book Intercultural Communication, define communication as a form of human behavior that results from a need to interact with other human beings. As a result of this need, we send verbal and nonverbal messages to communicate with both friends and strangers. Communications can take the form of talk, or it can take the form of gestures, or nonverbal signals of one kind or another. The talk or signals send messages that communicate a person's thoughts, feelings, and intentions to others. Many scholars study the topic of communication in general, and speech communication specifically, in order to learn how individuals send and interpret messages. A number of these scholars conduct research on the topic of intercultural communication. That is, they study communication between people from different cultures. One area of research in intercultural communication is the study of the influence of the setting or environment on the success and or failure of communication. In this lecture, I will be talking about one specific aspect of intercultural communication. That is, intercultural communication that takes place in the classroom. This information is taken from a book chapter written by Janice Anderson and Robert Powell titled Intercultural Communication and the Classroom. It appeared in Samovar and Porter's edited book, Intercultural Communication. When you are asked to picture a classroom in your mind's eye, what do you see? You probably see a classroom that is familiar to you, and that would be familiar to students from your culture. However, not everyone will see the same picture in their minds. Although many people have similar images of what a classroom looks like in their mind's eye, their culture greatly influences the way they view the teacher-student relationship, and culture also influences how a person understands the ways in which information is taught and learned in the classroom. Culture also plays an important role in determining how teachers and students communicate in the classroom. In this lecture, I'll give you a few examples of some of the ways that culture affects this communication. The classroom, as we know it, by the way, is a relatively recent innovation, according to Janice Anderson and Robert Powell. Great teachers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Confucius taught without the benefit of a board, chalk, desks, the standard comforts or discomforts of a classroom building. But let me return to the main topic of this lecture, the influence of culture on behavior and communication between teacher and students in the classroom. If you have come from another culture to study in the United States, you may already have noticed that teachers and students in American universities interact and communicate in the classroom in the ways that differ from how teachers and students communicate in your home culture. It's culture that influences and establishes these interactions and communication patterns. Of course, culture is a term that is used in many different ways. Basically, culture provides us with a system of knowledge that allows us to communicate with others and teaches us how to interpret their verbal and nonverbal behavior. Culture influences and establishes how people interact with one another, or do not interact with one another. In particular, culture influences the rituals that take place in the classroom setting, and it influences the way that students participate in the classroom discourse. It also influences the esteem in which teachers are held. Just what exactly are rituals? Well, I'll give you a dictionary definition to begin with. Rituals are systematic procedures used to perform a certain act or to communicate a certain message. Well, there are many rituals associated with teaching and learning, and education in general. Rituals are systematic procedures used to perform a certain act or to communicate a certain message. In some countries, when a teacher enters the classroom, the students ritually stand up. In the United States, a ritual occurs when a student raises her hand to signal the teacher that she knows the answer to a question. This is not a universal classroom ritual to signal intent to answer a question, however. Jamaican students snap or flap their fingers to signal that they want to answer a question that has been posed. In some college and graduate level seminars in American universities, students do not make any physical signs when they want to speak. They state their ideas whenever they feel the urge or when it's appropriate. This sort of classroom behavior is especially confusing to students from cultures in which there are no rituals for attracting the teacher's attention, because the student is not expected to participate in the class at all. This brings us to the issue of classroom participation. North American students of European origin are usually more talkative in class and more willing to state their opinions than students of Native American heritage or from Asian backgrounds. This difference is directly related to cultural values about learning and education and classroom behavior. Euro-American students' cultures teach them that learning is shaped and helped by their talk and active engagement in exploring or discussing issues. Asian students, however, are generally taught that they will learn best by listening to and absorbing the knowledge being given to them by the teacher. In their article, Anderson and Powell point out that some cultures do not have a way for students to signal a desire to talk to a teacher. In these cultures, students speak out only after the teacher has spoken to them. Most classroom interaction in Vietnam is tightly controlled by the teacher, according to Anderson and Powell. The esteem in which teachers are held also varies from culture to culture. According to researchers Samovar and Porter, the Vietnamese have a great deal of respect for their instructors and consider them to be honored members of society. The Vietnamese and many other Asian peoples see the teacher, the instructor, and the professor as the very symbol of learning and culture. In Germany, students value the personal opinions of their instructors, and it is not customary to disagree with or contradict a teacher during class. Israeli students, on the other hand, can criticize an instructor if they feel that he or she is wrong about an issue, or they believe has provided incorrect information, according to Samovar and Porter. There are many other ways that culture can affect interaction and communication between teachers and students in the classroom. I have discussed differences in how students get the teacher's attention during class, and I have pointed out the differences in the way students from various cultures participate and communicate with the teacher during class. From this brief consideration of classroom communication, you should begin to see that learning a language involves more than studying the vocabulary, idioms, and the grammar of the language. If you are to succeed in communicating in a second language classroom, you need to learn not only the language spoken in the classroom, but also the expected procedures of classroom participation and communication. That is, the rituals of language, culture, and communication.
In the last lecture, you heard about the relationship between culture and classroom communication. In this lecture, I'll talk about another variable that affects human communication. That variable is gender. Gender is the social identity that men and women learn as they grow up in a culture. For example, boys learn to be masculine and girls learn to be feminine as they grow to be men and women. Researchers have shown that men and women, and boys and girls for that matter, communicate in quite different ways and in different amounts depending on the situation the speakers find themselves in, and the reason or reasons they're communicating with other people. Many cultures actually encourage men and women to talk differently and in different amounts, and these patterns for communicating are learned when men and women are young boys and girls. Children learn how to talk to other children or adults and how to have conversations, not only from their parents, but also from their peers, other boys and girls their age. In her best-selling book, You Just Don't Understand, Deborah Tannen points out that although American boys and girls often play together, they spend most of their time playing in same-sex groups. She also points out that boys and girls do play some games together, but their favorite games are very often quite different. Tannen and other researchers on this topic have found that young boys, say ages 8 through 12, tend to play outside the home rather than in, and they play in large groups that are hierarchically structured. The group of boys generally has a leader who tells the other boys what to do and how to do it. It is by giving orders and making the other boys play by the rules that boys achieve higher and more dominant status in the play group. Boys also achieve status by taking center stage. They take center stage by talking a lot. They give orders and commands. They tell a lot of stories and jokes. They command attention by dominating conversations and by interrupting other boys who are speaking. The researchers also found that boys' games often have clear winners and losers and elaborate systems of rules. Researchers found that girls play different kinds of games and abide by different rules when playing their game. In addition, girls and groups use different patterns of communication and different styles of communication when playing together. Tannen and her colleagues have found that young girls often play in small groups or in pairs. They play less often in large groups or teams outside the home. Girls' play is not so hierarchically ordered as boys' play is. In their most frequent games, like hopscotch and jump rope, every girl gets a chance to play. In many of their play activities, such as playing house, there are no winners or losers. Researchers have also found that girls usually don't give many direct orders or commands to their playmates. They express their preferences as suggestions, according to Tannen. Girls often say to their playmates, "Let's do this or that." Boys, on the other hand, are more direct in ordering their playmates to do this or that. Tannen is quick to point out that North American boys, as well as girls, want to get their way and want other children to do what they want them to do. However, boys and girls try to get their playmates to do what they want them to do in different ways. Another well-known researcher, Marjorie Harness Goodwin, compared boys and girls engaged in two task-oriented activities. The boys were making slingshots in preparation for a fight. The girls were making jewelry. They were making rings for their fingers. Goodwin noted that the boys' activity group was hierarchically arranged. The leader told the other boys what to do and how to do it. The girls making the rings were more egalitarian. Everyone made suggestions about how to make the rings, and the girls tended to listen and accept the suggestions of the other girls in the group. Goodwin is not suggesting that girls never engage in some of the communication and management behaviors boys engage in. In fact, in another study, she found that when girls play house, the girl who plays the mother gives the orders to the girls who play the children. Girls seem to give orders to their peers less often than boys do when they play. The girls are practicing parent-child relationships in the game of playing house. It's very likely that when little boys play their games, they are also practicing the masculine roles they're expected to assume when they grow up. As a result of our cultural upbringing, we learn norms of behavior and patterns of communication that are often gender-based and sometimes gender-biased. We also develop stereotypes about how and how much males and females, that is, boys and girls or women and men, should and do communicate. However, researchers have shown that many of these stereotypes actually turn out to be quite wrong. A common stereotype that many people hold is the idea that women talk a lot, perhaps too much, and that they're always interrupting or trying to get center stage when someone else is talking. There is, in fact, a proverb that reinforces this idea. It states that foxes are all tail and women are all tongue. Actually, recent research on the influence of gender on communication has shown the exact opposite to be true in many instances. Researchers have found that men usually produce more talk than women and are more likely to interrupt another speaker than women will, particularly in public settings such as business meetings. So, although women are believed to talk more than men, study after study has shown that it is men who talk more at meetings, in mixed group discussions, and in classrooms where girls or young women sit next to boys or young men. And this finding holds even for communicative interactions between very educated and successful professional men and women, such as professors, for example. Deborah Tannen, in her book, You Just Don't Understand, cites a study conducted by Barbara and Jean Eakins, who tape recorded and studied 7 university faculty meetings. They found that, with one exception, men professors spoke more often and without exception for a longer period of time than women professors did. The men took center stage and talked from 10.66 seconds to 17.07 seconds, while the women talked from 3 to 10 seconds on the average. Tannen points out that the women's longest turns were still shorter than the men's shortest turns. Angela Simeone reports another example of this phenomenon in her book, Academic Women. She found that women professors talk at departmental meetings less often than their male colleagues do. When asked how often they spoke at departmental meetings, 46% of the American men professors reported that they spoke often at these meetings, but only 15% of the women professors reported that they spoke often at departmental meetings. Perhaps it is our social concept of what is feminine and what is masculine that reinforces the stereotype that women talk more than men, and even causes these different patterns of communication. Maybe a woman is labeled talkative or is criticized for interrupting if she does these things at all, because our culture, as well as many cultures, teaches that women should be quiet if they want to be feminine. Perhaps masculine culture encourages boys and men to dominate, talk, and interrupt more often, and males who talk a lot and interrupt are often not criticized for doing so. These differences in the patterns of communication and styles of communicating are studied by researchers who study the effects of gender on communication. They study these effects in order to understand why misunderstandings occur between men and women in conversation. Often it's because their styles and patterns of conversation are so different. It is important that we learn to recognize these differences so that we can learn to communicate better with people of other gender. It is important to emphasize that these differences may be specific to North American culture. Gender can affect communication in even more and stronger ways in some other cultures. In Zulu culture, for example, a wife is forbidden to say any words that sound like the names of her father-in-law or brothers. This means she must paraphrase these words, and she's expected to do so. So you see, cultural differences are not the only things that affect language and communication. Language is affected by gender as well. I'm sure you can think of many ways that gender affects communication between men and women in your own culture.
I'd like to begin today's lecture by asking a few simple questions. Why do people look different from cats, from horses, and from birds? Why do people look different from each other? Why do you look different from your sister or brother? The answer to all these questions lies in the genes of people and animals. Your genes provide biological instructions that control how you look, how you function, and even partly how you behave. Genes determine how every living creature on Earth appears, how it functions, how it reproduces, and generally how it behaves. Now, Genes are found inside the cells of the body and are passed down or inherited from one generation to the next. You may, for example, have inherited the color of your hair from your mother, or your ability to roll your tongue from your father. Or you may have inherited some other interesting trait you may or may not be grateful for from your great-great-great-grandfather or grandmother. Who knows? Inherited traits or abilities are determined by combinations of genes that are different for every human being. Although each individual is really quite unique, it's interesting to note that most genes are common to every person on Earth. In fact, humans share many of the same genes with other kinds or species of animals, from the simple little fruit fly to our close cousin, the apes. Do you realize that the small African ape, called the bonobo, shares 97% of the same genes we have? I don't know whether that's good news or not for us, or for the bonobos. The study of genes is a branch of the field of biology called genetics. And the scientists who study how genes are inherited and passed from one generation to the next are called geneticists. The field of genetics actually dates back to the mid-1800s, but most of what we know today about genes and about genetic disorders has been learned in only the last few decades. But don't let me jump ahead to what's going on in modern genetics before we acknowledge and briefly examine the work of a pioneer in biology, Gregor Mendel, who lived from 1822 to 1884. Mendel carried out some of the earliest experiments in genetics by studying the simple pea plant. Between 1856 and 1863, he grew more than 28,000 pea plants, and he kept very careful records on these 28,000 plants. From these records, he saw clearly that there was a predictable pattern by which plant traits or characteristics were passed from one generation of the pea plant to the next, a pattern that had never been reported before. He explained the patterns in principles or laws. Today, these principles are known as the Mendelian laws of heredity. Because we're talking about Gregor Mendel, let me make an aside and tell you something interesting about Mendel that might make him seem more real to you. In 1851, he was sent to the University of Vienna to study mathematics and experimental biology, the two subjects that were to make him so famous throughout the world. However, after 2 years of studying at the University of Vienna, he left the university. He was extremely nervous and uptight about taking examinations. It seems that this extreme nervousness about taking examinations kept him from completing his degree. Now, taking examinations makes everyone nervous, but apparently this disability did poor Gregor Mendel in terms of his university studies. However, the examination disability did not stop him from conducting his research or from becoming one of the most famous scientists of all time. Now, where was I? Yes. I was talking about genes and the passing of certain traits and characteristics from one generation to another. Many of your individual traits, including the color and shape of your eyes, the texture of your hair, and even your height and weight, resemble those of your parents. Your parents have passed traits on to you, and this passing of traits from parents to offspring, as we know, is called heredity. From the earliest ages, people have been interested in studying and understanding how heredity works. People have been interested in learning how they could alter crop plants, like corn, to give corn the traits that would make the corn crop more plentiful and better tasting. And today, they can do that. Humans also have always been interested in learning how to improve the breeding of domestic animals to make them more valuable and useful. In the case of racehorses, for example, owners want to breed strong, beautiful, and fast horses that can run faster than their competitors' horses can run. The famous racehorse Seabiscuit was offspring or son of a very famous champion racehorse called Man of War. Now, undoubtedly, Man of War passed on traits of strength and speed that helped his son Seabiscuit race faster than so many other horses, even though Seabiscuit was a small horse when compared to the other larger horses he raced. Okay, well, where was I? Before DNA and chromosomes were discovered, when Gregor Mendel began his experiments, heredity was one of the greatest mysteries of science. As I mentioned previously, Mendel studied science at the University of Vienna, and there he learned how to use mathematics to try to explain natural phenomena. While in Vienna, he studied the work of a man called Knight, another early pioneer in the study of heredity and genetics. Knight had crossed, or mated, a variety of the garden pea that has violet flowers with a variety that had white flowers. To his surprise, he found that all of the offspring of the crosses had only violet flowers. However, when two of the violet-flowered offspring were crossed or mated, their offspring produced both violet and white flowers. The white color trait had reappeared in the second generation of the plant. Now, Knight was puzzled by this reappearance of the white flowers in the second generation, and he was unable to explain why this had happened. Mendel decided to repeat Knight's work on the garden pea plant, called Pisum sativum in Latin, but he decided to apply his knowledge of mathematics and statistics to help him predict the results or the outcome of the crossbreeding of the white flowering and the violet flowering plants. Now, you might ask why Mendel used the simple garden pea rather than a rose or some other flowering plant. Also, why did he use a pea rather than an animal to study the puzzle of heredity? Well, Mendel had a number of good reasons for choosing to study the pea plant. For one thing, the plant was readily available and plentiful where he lived in Austria. Second, the peas could be cultivated quickly and with little effort. And most important, from a mathematician's perspective, the garden pea plant produced a large number of baby pea plants or offspring. Actually, it seems that the garden pea was a very good subject for studying heredity for several other reasons as well. The garden pea plant has many traits that have two clearly different forms that are easy to tell apart, such as color. Let me give you an example. The color of a pea plant is either violet or white. There is no intermediate form of color. Next, the mating of garden pea flowers can easily be manipulated, so Mendel was able to control the mating of the plant easily and then observe the offspring plants that resulted from the mating. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, Mendel grew more than 28,000 plants and recorded the many offspring of these plants. And he did all this counting and record keeping long before computers were available for record keeping and statistical analyses. Just imagine. We are still benefiting today from the early research done by Gregor Mendel. As a result of his research, today we understand much more about genetics and heredity, though there is still so much to be learned. For instance, we know that genes are tiny biochemical structures inside each cell that determine particular hereditary traits, such as eye color, blood type, maybe intelligence, and so on. But we must remember that the gene only gives the potential for the development of a particular trait. How this potential is achieved or realized depends partly on the interaction of the gene with other genes, and it depends partly on the environment. For example, a person may have a genetic tendency toward being overweight, but the person's actual weight will depend on a number of environmental factors, such as how much and what kinds of food the person eats. Yes, we are what we eat, and thanks to the fact that our ancestors ate and mated, we are. But then it's almost time for lunch, and my inherited hunger trait must be reminding me to end our talk and let you and me go to lunch. I'll see you next time. All right, I started out our last session together by asking a few questions that led me to talk about two major issues in biology. One of the major issues I talked about was Mendel's experiments on the garden pea plant and his findings about how certain traits are passed from one generation to the next. The other major issue I talked about was the role heredity and genetics play in who we are, what we look like, and how we generally behave. And I need to stress that word generally when I say how we generally behave. Today, I'll be talking about the topic of genetic engineering. I'll be talking about what genetic engineering is And I'll be touching on some of the potential advantages and some of the very real dangers that genetic engineering brings with it. I'll be giving some examples of genetic engineering projects, mainly in the field of agriculture, but also in the field of medicine. I'll also mention some of the cons of genetic engineering, especially the new microorganisms. Finally, I hope to finish up the lecture by explaining in more detail exactly how genetic engineering works. I hope to cover all these topics, but as you know, I sometimes get sidetracked or off topic in my lectures, and I sometimes run out of time, but let's see how things go. Okay, let me again start off with some questions. Do you realize that today we can grow orange plants or lemon plants from orange or lemon tissue in vesicles, which are small bladder-like bags? Some industry analysts believe that the day is not far off when orange juice will be grown, as it were, in vats, and there will be no need to plant orange or lemon orchards or groves to obtain orange juice. Question: is this a good idea and a benefit for humankind? Think about it. In the field of animal research, scientists are working to develop engineered super animals. These super animals will have enhanced characteristics for food production, such as extra nutritional value or lower fat content. Some scientists are also creating new kinds of animals, called transgenic animals, that can serve as chemical factories to produce drugs and medicines for other animals, and maybe one day for human beings. Researchers are also trying to create animals that can serve as organ donors for humans. The question: is this the right thing to do to animals? To make them grow to supersize or use them as organ donors for people? That's the question. All right. Here's another possibly more controversial question involving genetic screening in medicine. Should a couple expecting a baby be able to make sure through genetic screening that the child they're expecting does not show signs of having inherited some hereditary disorder, such as very poor eyesight or mental depression, or don't forget that tendency to be overweight? Another more personal question. If you could, would you use genetic screening to find out if your future child or grandchild had an inherited disease in his or her genetic makeup? Now, it's certainly true that many diseases and disorders that people get are caused by agents such as viruses and bacteria, or things in the environment, such as pollutants. But we are learning today that the cause of a number of diseases, like certain kinds of cancer, and a disease like cystic fibrosis, are in fact genetic. These diseases are thought to be passed down from generation to generation. Take the genetic disorder known as hemophilia, for example. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder involving the blood clotting factor. The symptoms of hemophilia are uncontrolled internal and external bleeding if the hemophiliac gets even a small injury. Today, thanks to advances in medicine, the symptoms of hemophilia can be controlled by giving the hemophiliac injections of the blood clotting factor that's missing from the blood. As far as the issue of medical screening for genetic diseases, do you know that in the United States today, hospitals are screening newborn babies for a wide range of congenital or hereditary diseases, such as hemophilia and cystic fibrosis? By the year 2004, every state in the United States was requiring that newborn infants be tested for a long list of inherited diseases. That's the good news. But, and this is a pretty big but, with the knowledge we have of human genetics and with the techniques we have for screening newborns and even embryos, how long will it be before we're screening and maybe selecting human embryos for characteristics such as physical strength or other qualities such as eye or hair color? You name it. Should scientists engage in the genetic screening or engineering of human beings? But let me return to the topic of genetic engineering of plants and animals that's already going on in this biotech century of ours. We have already seen hints of the coming biotech revolution with the cloning of animals, such as the famous Dolly, who was born in 1996. By the way, did you know that Dolly the cloned sheep later gave birth to a lamb? demonstrating that clones originating in the laboratory are able to breed in the traditional way and are able to produce healthy offspring? Now just think about the implications of Dolly for a minute. Today, if we can produce cloned animals like sheep and mice, as we can, are we really that far from seeing the first human clone created? Some people will say, I can't wait for that to happen. Others will be horrified at the very thought. They believe that scientists who attempt to clone human beings, or animals for that matter, have overstepped the ethical boundaries of science and are even endangering the safety of humankind with their cloning experiments. Some people believe that genetic engineering and cloning is playing it smart. Others, however, think that genetic engineering and cloning is playing roulette with Mother Nature. Whatever you may think about the ethics of the genetic engineering of humans or animals, today biologists are using genetic engineering for two main purposes. One, in agriculture, to make hardier plants and crops for agriculture, and two, in medicine, to make newer and, they hope, better drugs for medicine. But let me start off with the field of agriculture. We can see the evidence of genetic engineering of crops sitting right on the supermarket shelves, probably in that box of cereal you bought at the supermarket recently. Did you know that by the year 2004, more than 50 crop plants had been genetically engineered, including potatoes, soybeans, and corn, just to name a few? Can you guess how much farm acreage is now devoted to genetically engineered crop production in the United States alone today? Well, let me tell you. Between the years 1998 to 2003, 68% of the soybean acreage, 26% of the corn acreage, and more than 69% of the cotton acreage were devoted to genetically engineered, or what they sometimes call transgenic crop production. That's a lot of genetic engineering going on in the early years of this coming biotech century, wouldn't you say? You know, I'll bet if you recently ate a tomato, it could have come from a transgenic tomato crop. And I'll also bet you didn't even know that you ate a genetically engineered tomato. For better or for worse, and in many countries, agriculture, especially, but not only, in the United States, has been impacted in serious and significant ways by the use of genetic engineering practices. The good news is that genetic engineering is able to produce crop plants that are more tolerant of stressful climate conditions, such as drought. In addition, genetic engineering can be used to control how fast or slow fruit ripens, so that crops can be shipped to markets far from the farm that grew the crop. Let me give you another example of one of the potential benefits of genetic engineering of crops. Plant geneticists have developed strains of crops that are resistant to some chewing insects, such as grasshoppers and beetles. The geneticists inserted a certain gene into the crop plants. This inserted gene makes a protein that injures the stomach of the insect that is chewing on the plant. Well, when that grasshopper or the beetle gets a bad stomach ache from chewing on the genetically engineered plant, it decides to leave and look for another plant to eat. As a result, the good news is that crops that are resistant to certain insects do not need to be sprayed with pesticides that do tremendous harm to our environment when they get into our rivers and water sources. Now, for some bad news about genetic engineering. Let me tell you a frightening story about a gene-altered monster that almost got away. That is, it almost got out of the laboratory. In the early 1990s, a European genetic engineering company was preparing to field test and then commercialize on a major scale a genetically engineered soil bacteria called Klebsiella planticola. For your notes, that's spelled Klebsiella Planticola. The genetically altered bacterium was developed to get rid of the crop residues, the part of the plant not harvested for food. The bacteria helped to decompose the plant material. The amazing and frightening thing was that the new soil bacteria, Klebsiella planticola, had been tested, as it turns out, in a careless and very unscientific manner by scientists working for the biotech industry. The biotech scientists believed that the bacterium was safe for the environment and would greatly aid farmers. Well, fortunately, a team of independent scientists decided to run their own tests on the gene-altered Klebsiella planticola. When they did, they discovered that the researchers from the biotech industry had apparently created a biological monster, a genetically engineered microorganism that could kill all terrestrial plants if it were released. After the exposure of the danger of this new bacterium, the gene-altered Klebsiella planticola was never commercialized. My point is that we need to be very careful about testing the safety of genetically engineered organisms before they come to the marketplace. In addition to finding evidence of genetic engineering in agriculture, we can also find evidence of genetic engineering in many of the drugs produced by pharmaceutical companies around the world. A key goal of genetic engineers is to make drugs that can cure genetic disorders such as cystic fibrosis and hemophilia, which I spoke about earlier. Another key goal is to produce new vaccines that will protect people against diseases such as smallpox and malaria, and against new diseases that will arise in the coming biotech century. Okay, I wanted to finish up the lecture by talking about how genetic engineering actually works, but I seem to have run out of time. So I'll ask you to read the section about how genetic engineering works in your textbook. It sums up in a nutshell how the process works. Well, that's about it for today. I'll see you next week.